Great. Well, welcome to the Whitney, to our boardroom. And I'm Scott. I'm the Senior Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the museum. I am not a specialist in the art of 1900 to 1950, but we have some people who are. And I'm delighted that any young people want to and are studying this period, because actually something I've been thinking a lot about is, for a collection like the Whitney's, we need future specialists in this area, particularly at a time when so many people are drawn to contemporary art, more and more so, I would say. But even in some of the people that I've hired since I became chief curator, I've looked for those in certain areas, particularly our prints and drawings curator, Kim Connedy, who have a strong background in pre-war American art. We also obviously have Barbara Haskell on our staff, who's been here for longer than I've been alive, according to the New York Times. And there's a few other great people who are coming up in the ranks. So I'm delighted this is a subject that people are continuing to apply themselves to at your age.
So do you think that the pendulum, which has swung so far towards contemporary, may swing back a little bit in terms of older art?
Yeah, I mean, we think about it all the time here, and obviously this museum is in a funny situation with regard to this question, because I think some people would say, well, but if you're a certain age and they remember seeing certain shows at the Uptown Whitney, so shows that Barbara did, that this idea of like classic American modernist art is like the bread and butter of the Whitney. And then someone else could say, but wait, when the Whitney was founded, it was really founded to support living artists, and the historical reach of the era that it covered. Now granted, there were some 19th century things, some folk art, which there aren't anymore, but was actually a much narrower period of time, which would also have been true of MoMA, for example. So now when we look at our collection, it spans 120 years. It used to be that we used to think of like 1945 or the pre and post-war as the kind of dividing line, and it isn't anymore. So in a way, I won't say that like the pendulum has swung back, but we have maybe a different sense of proportionality. And I would say that at different times in the history of the museum, its recent history, there's been an idea that we were going to really continue to collect and focus and show more of the art of our time. But I've come to feel that there's so much interesting work to do in American art before 1950 that's not being quite thought of in the same way as institutions that are more sort of broadly devoted to contemporary art, even like MoMA or LA MoCA, or, I mean, obviously they don't have a collection that goes back as early as ours, with the exception of some kind of surrealist-y things. The MCA Chicago, like, what does this allow us to think about? And when I think of the acquisitions we made leading into our new building, and since then, a lot of attention has been paid to pre-war art, particularly interest in women and artists of color of this period that have been maybe more talked about in the contemporary space. So I think there's a lot of interesting work. I'm dying to do a Mabel Dwight show, for the record. I don't know that we will, but I think of things that like interest me that we put up, and I'm like, wow, where has this been hiding? Why don't we know more about? We had a talk today, and so many. It was about thinking about different chapters in women artists in American art, and most of the interesting proposals were all actually older, senior, dead figures. And we need people to be talking about, Nancy Elizabeth Prophet and Augusta Savage and, who else were we talking about? Elizabeth Catlett. Well, they sort of maybe were, but maybe just barely. I mean, Nancy Elizabeth Prophet was in the founding collection of the Whitney Museum, so was Richmond Barthe. So to speak about these two black artists as though that's like, oh my God, who are they? They were friends of Mrs. Whitney, or she collected their work. Barthe more than Nancy Elizabeth Prophet. And so that's not even like going out on a limb to try to figure out who we should be looking at in this earlier moment. So this is my long-winded, rambling way of saying, even though I said I'm not an expert in this area, I'm excited about the work that could be done there. I mean, Nick Mouse, who's an artist who's about my age, did a fantastic show that was drawn mostly from our collection about the kind of lens of ballet, using kind of the lens of ballet to look at the history of modernism in New York. And it brought him to Paul Cadmus and Pajama and Chelachev and all different artists. We always have a George Tucker on view at the Whitney, it seems. There's one there right now. There was a show at David's Warner Gallery that kind of leaned more heavily into the kind of queer side of this story. But there's tremendous, interesting histories to think about there in the 1930s and 40s, where fashion met dance, met some kind of form of modernism that got pushed a little to the side. And I think different methodological lenses arise, like queer studies or what have you, and awareness of the importance of certain artists of color in certain regional settings, and then you kind of look at all that stuff afresh.
It's kind of interesting to think about how you develop your ideas internally, what process. So let's say you come across Mabel Dodge, or a figure that you're interested in. What happens next? Let's say it's something that you would like to pursue.
Well, I am generally more the conductor of that orchestra or conversation. So what tends to happen is that I kind of create problems or questions to think about for the curators on my team, which is, there's about 30 people on the curatorial team, including curatorial assistants, assistant curators, senior curators. And so it's more a kind of directed conversation, and then they kind of think of things. And a lot of times they have their own individual passions, and then you have to sort of see and ideas whether those things can make sense within the bigger picture that I'm trying to kind of orchestrate at the museum. So it's less, I don't tend to assign topics like, you go do a show on Mabel Dwight, but I more kind of think of categories and problems that we should be exploring. One of the things we're thinking about, without giving away the game also in terms of this kind of pre-1950 question, is the history of performance as it's come to exist in major institutions mostly starts in 1960. And we're seeing, in a kind of post-Judson dance, Merce Cunningham-y story, Jasper Johns, Trisha Brown, whatever happened at MoMA, we have done this too. And I keep thinking that that's a kind of insufficient lens for thinking about intersections of art and music, and maybe it's not performance art, but who were the people who collaborated with Alvin Ailey, Catherine Dunham, incredible stories. Even Anna Halperin in a way. So I would there think again that some of the recent interest in certain fields methodologically could be rear projected to some extent without feeling totally anachronistic. And I think that's an exciting kind of challenge that I keep putting to the curators. Yes, I was told not to prepare anything, that you all would have questions. So just ask questions. We have until 5. Oh, okay, then you tell who they are. You can have, I'm here for you.
I know there are students that prepare questions, but I'm just listening to what you're saying, and it got me thinking. This may be an uneducated question because I haven't been thinking about this topic until you just brought it up, but when you talk about taking a new lens to rear project and kind of look at the past in a different way, how do you go about finding, or how do the curators go about finding works that kind of fit into that and fulfill that when they haven't been identified in the past because you're looking at it in a new way? Or have they been identified in the past? It's just...
Well, I think it's a little of both. Let's start with the Whitney's collection. We have 25,000 objects in our collection that have been acquired. The museum was founded circa 1930. Some of those objects came into our founders' collection in the previous decades. So even just saying, well, you don't have to go look that far. Those things are in a database that's digitally accessible. The work on paper is in this building. So sometimes we're just kind of digging back through what it was that any one of my predecessors thought was important at that time, and kind of asking new questions about them, or the works that didn't seem maybe that relevant at one time might seem more relevant now. For example, when we reopened the museum, we had a gallery that was devoted to prints that were made as part of various artist-driven efforts to pass legislation or draw attention, anti-lynching legislation, let's say, or legislation drawing attention to the horrors of lynching. These were not unknown to art historians, but they had not been shown that often at the Whitney, in my memory, in the previous 5 or 6 years that I worked at the museum before we opened downtown. And probably one of the things that drew us to think about them was that we were in a conversation about Black Lives Matter, about police violence, which is not exactly the case in most of these lynchings, but about how we think about histories in America that have to do with these questions. That might also be similar when I was talking about some of the interest in some kind of queer artists or imagination kind of before Stonewall, let's say. So it's like, well, now you're after there, but do you go back and look and find these things that are there? Now, of course, then you could expand the conversation to be, well, who was never a part of the Whitney's collection? Archibald Motley was never a part of the Whitney's collection, but he was one of the artists with whom we began our program downtown, who had showed at the Whitney during his lifetime, but was a missing artist. So you kind of don't want to use your own history always as the lens, because then you can repeat the omissions. But at other times, it's a kind of useful thing to think about as a starting point, maybe.
As a follow-up to that, is the Whitney acquiring historical works that might be missing from the collection, like that example?
Yeah, well, there's an Archibald Motley painting on the 7th floor on view right now that we purchased 4 years ago. I mean, since I've been chief curator, I guess. So in a very focused manner. I would say more photography, drawing, and prints than painting. One of our recent, most kind of proudest acquisitions, which is not before 1950, but in the sort of first half of that 120-year arc-ish, is the Norman Lewis painting that's on view also on the 7th floor. That's from the early 60s, but we spent, and there's an Ed Clark also from, I think, 1959. We spent about 7 years trying to find like the very perfect best Norman Lewis that was still possibly would ever come into our hands. I love an Aaron Douglas. That's not going to be that easy to find in terms of, there's very few in private collections still. But, you know, and the prices of a lot of these artists has gone up. The Elizabeth Catlett terracotta head that's in the window on the 7th floor, that was a recent-ish acquisition during my time at the museum. So we do. And we also, especially as I said, in photography and prints and drawings. Palmer Hayden drawing we bought not that long ago. Yeah.
Great. If you want, Lydia, do you guys want to start with your question?
Yeah, sure. That's good. Well, I was curious about what led you to become a curator and what challenges you might have faced at the beginning of your career.
Okay. I don't want to say I think I always thought I would be a curator, because I don't think I knew what that was when I was like a kid, but I always loved being around art, and that was always the thing I cared the most about, probably since I was like 10 years old. So I think that the best reason to become a curator is because you want to spend time around art. That sounds really dumb, but actually I don't take it for granted among all people in my colleagues, not at this museum, yes, but not generally. And I think then the second thing you want to do is think about how being around that art might interface in some manner with the public. So if you cared less about that, maybe you become a professor, which is great, or then you're talking to students more often than I do. But you have to think about that membrane between your interest as maybe an academic or a lover of art, and how you help kind of communicate that to an audience, whatever that means. Not that you don't do that as a writer, but it's just a different scale. So I studied art history in college, and probably always thought that I would work at a museum. Not always, maybe there was a moment where I was kind of like, maybe I'd become a professor, and I went to grad school. But I was at that time writing for Art Forum, and had an opportunity, there was a kind of changing of the guard, this was several guards ago, I'm 43, and I was at this time 26, to move to New York and become an editor there, senior editor with a new editor-in-chief who was very young also, he was like 32 maybe. And I really struggled with this question of if I went and worked at a magazine, which had never been my ambition, would that take me off the path of becoming a curator, which had been my ambition at this point by the time I was in grad school. And I sort of thought, well, you know, I only have this one moment in my life to kind of be a youngish person in relation to young artists who are my age. So now I can be around young artists, but I'm older than them, and I don't know what songs they like, and I can barely DM on Instagram. So the questions that maybe are the most alive to them generationally are already a little removed from me, and I'm the chief curator at the Whitney, so that's kind of weird and intimidating. And so there was this moment where I thought I could kind of I didn't think about it quite like this. I thought about it much more romantically. I was thinking about like, oh, when Henry Geldzahler was a curator at the Met and he was having drinks with Andy Warhol, you know, like, could you like come to New York and find that moment? And so that's sort of what brought me here and took me off the path I thought I was on. And then after doing that for a number of years, realized that the kind of grueling monthly cycle of putting out a magazine and the kind of appetite for contemporary art that I missed a slightly more sort of scholarly, deliberate way of thinking. And so then that was 10 years ago I came to the Whitney. I didn't answer your question about challenges, but I don't know. There's other people have questions. I mean, I can answer challenges. There's lots of them.
I guess kind of similar to what you were speaking about earlier, but I wanted to ask, when you're planning an exhibition or acquiring new works to the Whitney's collection, how do you factor public education into your decision making?
Well, it's a very big central part of our thinking, but generally not in choosing to do an exhibition. And I would say, you know, we have an incredible education department at this museum, and part of what makes them so incredible is that they have to be these kind of like amazing interpreters of work that is very challenging to a lot of people, to a broad public. And so if you thought like from a public education, like #1 standpoint, you probably would not do like a giant Rachel Harrison show, which is what we're opening on October 22nd, because it's like, oh my God, that's so obscure, and what's this art about? And so in a way, the education piece follows like a little bit after, but they always sort of like, when we work together with the education department, and I, by the way, as much as the museum field needs curators, it needs people in education departments, it needs people in accounting, it needs people like in special events and fundraising, and the more people who have an art history background in any of these places, the better the work of the museum. So I also always say to students who are thinking about museum work, the curators, what I say, there's 30 people in my department out of 400 something people who work at this museum. That's a great ambition, but there's a lot of really important and valuable work to do in all other areas of the museum. Registration, I mean, I like to talk about all of them. But the education team here is extremely adept at helping to kind of convey sophisticated, challenging, sometimes very incendiary and upsetting works of art to the public. I mean, we've had, because of the nature of the work that we do and the artists we work with, you are constantly being thrown back a little and surprised at, oh my God, now there's this thing in the galleries. How do we talk about that to the public, to the press, to our staff? That can be very interesting, and they really are help lead that conversation.
I was also wondering if there are any exhibitions that you found particularly meaningful or challenging to work on, and why?
Every one. I mean, it's hard. That's a hard question to answer because there's so many different facets of it. I tended in my curatorial work thus far, like my personal curatorial work, which is a little different than what I've done with the collection, or the work of kind of managing a team of people and helping advise them and make their shows better. All the shows that happen at the Whitney now I'm involved with to some extent or another. But without planning on it, I ended up really focusing a lot on a series of monographic exhibitions of artists between the age of 50 and, well, 45 and 60, let's say, at mid-career, if you want to call it that. Wade Guyton, Glenn Ligon, Laura Owens, Jeff Koons, those are the 4 that I've done so far. Doing one with Jasper Johns, which is a different kind of situation because he's going to be 90. But this was an area of curating that I think nobody was actually that interested in or talking about among curatorial studies people. It was like, oh, I'm so interested in being Harold Zeman and making the Venice Biennale and having all these ideas that precede maybe the work of art because I'm going to make a show about global warming or capitalism or whatever, which are all fine shows to do. The disappearance of the object. And I think maybe the assumption is that in doing a retrospective or a survey, there's nothing for the curator to do because that you kind of line these things up in order and like where's the kind of intellectual challenge and the authorship function of the curator. And I believe that the shows I've done and the books like that of those 4 that I mentioned were all like super precise exhibitions and the kind of tailoring of the selection of the objects and the way they lived in space and the very different books that accompany each of them. And so maybe that's a funny way of answering your question, to say that like that problem has been the one, or that has kind of like interested me the most deeply, and how to kind of reinvent that idea. And if we were having like a slide talk, I could then give examples of what I mean by that. You know, on the other hand, I've been very lucky to work on a number of shows from the Whitney's collection, and that's just so exciting and interesting. And maybe the thing to say about that is something that I've really had to sort of not struggle with, but embrace, was the idea that that's where you really look beyond your taste, or I do, and not every curator does. And so if I say like, oh yeah, Wade Guyton, well that's like the artist of my generation that I'm the most excited about and kind of grew up with. But when I came to the Whitney, I realized that I was like this, I don't want to say like stepdad, because that sounds pejorative, but you're like the foster parent or something of all these works of art that you didn't really choose, and you may not even like, and they're not really up your alley necessarily. And you can either decide to like play favorites with the things you like the best, or you can say, wait, I'm gonna now let these things that other people thought were important at different stages in history kind of reshape my thinking. So in fact, all of the pre-war artists that I named during the course of this conversation, probably not one of them did I ever hear named in 8 years at Harvard, like just literally 100%. I can't think of any of them, practically not even Edward Hopper. So you find yourself, like definitely not Fairfield Porter, like suddenly like looking at all this stuff and saying, wait, this is my inheritance or responsibility, briefly, and then I'll pass it around to the next guy or girl, woman. And so in working with the collection, it's like a different set of a lens where maybe you want to push yourself in your taste, but through your understanding of what might feel kind of relevant or alive today. So that's a different set of circumstances and maybe responsibilities.
What is the process behind curating an exhibition like the Whitney Biennial?
Well, the process of curating an exhibition like the Whitney Biennial is, there's not like, the like there is very different than the process of curating an exhibition like the Jeff Koons retrospective. But curating a Whitney Biennial, or a show like that, which maybe would be like the New Museum Triennial or the Venice Biennale or those kind of shows, Greater New York, is that they're kind of field research, really. You know, I just appointed the new curators for the next one, which is scary to think about. We'll open in 18 months. I've barely recovered from the present one. That process for them, and I've never curated one, and I've always avoided it assiduously, even though I've now appointed 3 teams of people to do it, and including 5 of 6 people that I've actually hired at the museum, is they go out in the world and they see stuff. And it's just about looking as much as they can, about traveling, about being in artist studios. Obviously they're reading what's going on, they're looking at Instagram, they're maybe talking to colleagues and friends who they like. I can think of some of the artists actually on the 6th floor right now. We have the kind of like tail end of the biennial, the bulk of it on the 5th floor closed, but there's an artist in the window on the 6th floor called Daniel Lynn Ramos, who's got to be in his 60s, from Puerto Rico, who definitely was not on the radar of the curators whatsoever. But when they were doing their research in Puerto Rico, other artists said, have you been to Danielle? Have you been to Danielle? Have you been to Danielle? And that's how he ended up in the biennial. So that is, it's a kind of, it is a research project. I think people maybe who are more academic or a certain kind of curator are like, oh, that's just contemporary art. It's like, well, what does that look like as a form of scholarship even? I mean, depending on how you define it. And then it's a form of argument making about what you care about and why does it matter and what things kind of speak to one another. So it's a very intense process. I mean, it starts today, it opens in 18 months. You know, it starts, as I said, appointing the curators on Monday. There's a certain period where they're like out and about looking at everything. There's a period where they have to kind of start creating a list. The artists have to start making their work. There's a lot of back and forth about whether they're going to show work that exists or make new work. There's kind of a jockeying around of space and money. And it is, you know, we had in the last biennial artists in the gallery, one, Jennifer Packer, with a paintbrush and painting on a painting like the day of the press preview. So it's can be a nail biter, that show. Very different kind of project from doing a Jasper Johns retrospective where the whole thing's got to get like so buttoned up, so long in advance. You're maybe waiting to get certain loans or hope a check comes through, but you have to, much different idea. It's like not a moving target.
We tell our students that's not allowed, no painting in the gallery for their thesis show.
Okay.
So anyone here in this class, and a couple painters. So
Oh, are some of you art students, not art history students? Oh, okay, great.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about curating the Jeff Koons retrospective and what it was like to curate the first comprehensive retrospective for such a famous artist?
It was very hard and crazy. And having done it, I know why no one had ever done it before, but I didn't quite understand that to begin with. I mean, that's a funny story. That was like probably the two shows that I've done here that meant the most to me, like in a very deep personal way, was the Wade Guyton show, which I mentioned, because that was kind of like telling the story of like a person who I was so kind of intimate with, in every sense of the word. We were not boyfriends, but you know, we were such close friends, and we looked at art together, and we shared so much, and we kind of grew up together. And in a way, the way that I wrote about his work maybe even almost shaped his understanding of his work, and the work he made shaped my understanding of being a curator, a critic, or whatever I was becoming. And the Jeff Koons thing is different from that because it was someone who was a famous artist by the time I ever saw his work. And I remember my very first encounter of his work when I was in high school in a Borders bookstore in Dallas, Texas, in the previous survey catalog that SF MoMA made, which would have been, I don't know, the early 90s. And there had never been such a show in New York. And then my show is almost 20 years later. I'm not good at math. Yeah, basically, 2014. So I just had a kind of obsession with this artist, and continued to have an obsession with this artist all the while in college and graduate school, being told by the people I respected, who were mostly associated with October magazine, that this artist was like terrible and the devil and represented all of the worst, you know, urges of capitalism, of, you know, wealth consolidation, of retarded interest in craft and, you know, hokey materials and kitsch, and I mean, just like everything that you weren't supposed to be into. And interestingly, these very intelligent people who I greatly admire had made a way of creating allowances for like so many other things, but not this. Whether that was like, oh, but Andy Warhol, he's kind of okay. And that could be a whole long conversation about why or not why. And Jeff's work became a kind of strange like lens, I keep using that term, for me to understand the art world as I was growing up in it, particularly when I was at Art Forum. You know, like, well, but who are these people, and what is this money, and like, what's this stuff that I'm supposed to not be talking about or feel embarrassed by, and how could I sort of use his work to almost like focus or understand all this other stuff that was going on, the idea of an artist as a celebrity or in a fashion magazine. Like everywhere I turned, he sort of looked like a kind of strange, like, test case, or I have this, not to quote myself, but something where I talked about like this balloon dog, like the cold surface that was like condensing the hothouse flows of capital and desire and eros. Like you could just see like the beads of sweat forming on the balloon dog. And that interested me. Like, well, what did that mean? You couldn't really see the beads of sweat unless you shouldn't at a museum have humidity problems like that. But so it was something that I felt like I'd had to do. And I wanted to write my dissertation about him, and I was told I could not. Maybe one of the reasons that I ended up dropping out of grad school. And when I got to the Whitney, I thought, okay, even before I started here, I told the director and the then chief curator, well, this is what I want to do. And they were kind of like, okay, well, a lot of people have been down that road, and they like get to the skull and crossbones and don't enter, or they turn to stone. And I thought like maybe I would have a way of doing this, because I had a dialogue with Jeff, and I thought if we could kind of come up with an ask that made sense, like the kind of farewell to the last building. And it was an adventure, and if I never wanted another job in a museum, I could write a really neat book about it, because the kind of complexity of dealing with the collectors and the artist and the works that had yet to be finished, and the engineering around getting them all in the building was really, really fascinating, and something I'm, you know, proud of. And I really was clear that it had to be a Jeff Koons show, but not like Jeff Koons' show, and that this was an artist who had not had real experience being curated, and that's a kind of whole interesting thing when you work with living artists. The extent to which they kind of want to auto-curate, or they'll let other people bring their ideas. This goes back to that authorship question I put forward about the retrospective. And so if you were to, this would be another class I could teach, look just at that show, at every room, there would be ways where I could talk about these were the decisions I made. Some of which, like Jeff really resisted, and others of which he embraced. And if he resisted them, it wasn't because he was being, obtuse or even uncooperative. It was because he didn't see his work that way. And it's hard if you're an artist who's used to seeing yourself and the things you make in a certain manner to have someone else say, but hey, what if we line up all the banality sculptures like this? Well, that's not how they're meant to be seen. But they all have faces. They're frontal. You think they're meant to be in the round, but they're really frontal. They're not Richard Serra sculptures. So what if we made a situation that would accentuate that? Now, I imagine you all are too young, most of you, to have seen this show. That was now already 5 years ago. But there are pictures of it online if you want to see. Other questions? I'm going to just keep my eye on the time because I do have a hard stop, as they say. 11 more minutes.
Great. Well, hearing about your experiences with the retrospective and the biennial, how does design kind of play into your role as chief curator?
A lot. You mean design of walls or graphic design? Oh yeah, the space. Yeah, very, very, a lot. So that's something that I think is not often thought about enough. And the feeling of how shows sit in this building is very important to me, and something that I've tried to kind of establish a voice in a way that the other curators sort of understand. And the whole sense of I'm always talking about experience, which sounds kind of dumb. Why not experience? But you're not making a book on the wall. You're not writing an essay, which is a different thing to do, which has its own sense of pace and emotion and whatever. But I want people to feel something at the Whitney very deeply, and that comes through in the selection of the work and the kind of emotional intelligence of the curating, hopefully in the art, but also in the physical awareness of how things are in space. So the biennial, I didn't choose any of the artists. I had many talk to the curators about their ideas, and it was a sounding board. But then the way it came to be installed and the walls and stuff, I was very involved with, and the kind of conversation among the works. It's the part that I enjoy the most. In fact, right before you came up here, I was down in the model, and I'm like a kid with Legos. I could lose myself in a model for hours, for this John's show that I'm working on. Yeah. I don't know who has prepared questions and who doesn't. So, okay.
Somebody else asked when I asked what.
Oh yeah. If anyone who hasn't asked a question would like to ask one, you should take advantage of that. Yeah.
So I noticed that you mentioned queer, Latinx, women, Black and Brown artists. So to you, what do you think is important about the intersectionality of art?
Oh, I think it's extremely important. I mean, intersectionality of art. Do you mean the art maker or the object somehow?
I guess the context of the objects, but also the art makers themselves, the fact that their identities are seen and their stories are also seen in the context of the work itself.
Right. Okay. So I think, very important, high level important, and it this is something I've really devoted a lot of my thinking to since I've become chief curator. When at that time all the curators were white when we opened our building downtown, except for one who I just hired, Chris Liu. And now we have, I have to count, but I would say 4 curators of color, which for a small team is a very big transformation. And the way that I've tried to think about that is that I think there's 2 ways to do it. One is you sort of look around and try to hire people, and it's a little bit more like checking boxes. The same thing with your program. You say, oh look, now we've bought a work by a Black artist or done this show. And I think there's a lot of that's happening in the field, and I think it's fine. I think it's better than nothing, but I don't think it's maybe the best way to think about it. And so did you use the word Latinx? Yeah, so that's interesting because that's a word that I didn't know 3 years ago. And I went to a symposium at the Ford Foundation. This is just an example of one of these topics. And it was about the question of Latinx artists in museums, galleries, whatever. And I came away from that. I was on the hot seat. The people who'd organized the symposium were and you, Whitney Museum, why have you never thought about Latinx artists before? And I was well, do you mean Latin American artists? No. I didn't say it quite like that. But they were right to push on this. And actually, I came away thinking, yeah, well, I think now in our collection we have something 80 Latinx artists out of 3,500 artists. I'm kind of being rough in my numbers, but not at all properly representative. why of all the areas that we should, there's many things you can do at any one time and you can't make up for all of the things that people before you didn't do. But why did I think that this was so important for this museum was that for me, the frame of the art of the United States, which is what we really are when we say American art, brings the question of like Latino and Latina artists, Latinx artists, if you want to use that term, into a kind of really profound focus. So if big institutions like Met or MoMA or Centre Pompidou or the Tate are all talking about Latin America, there's, which is great too, but we're not. The Chicano artists in Texas or LA or frankly New York City, the New Rican artists who are like, not just in Puerto Rico, they're here in the city in which I live, they're like, but wait, you don't think we're American, US artists, and we're not Latin American artists being collected by, you know, the Cisneros Foundation or whatever that, you know, the kind of major organizations are in the field. And so I thought, wow, there's this incredible opportunity for me in this period to find a way of kind of giving voice to this that is more than just like counting things, but like what does this look like? And so I hired this curator who's fantastic from the Hammer called Marcela Guerrero, but this is a huge research project for me. I don't speak Spanish, I don't read Spanish. Of course, you don't have to read, you kind of have to read Spanish to be a curator of Latinx art, I would say, because so many of these artists are working back and forth across different cultures. And it's been incredible. We have a fellow now. We have language translations in our galleries for some shows, not all. We're doing more with the press. But you know, you realize that if to take this seriously is a profound shift in the institutional thinking. The education department's got to figure out, are they going to do special tours for different people? Then you say, well, I don't assume that these artists don't speak English. Of course they do. So what are you trying to achieve by introducing these different questions of language? How do you then be clear that this category, Latinx, is really something very different than the category of, let's say, African American artists, most of whom don't maintain a large sort of sense of a kind of country of origin, the way that in a way you could argue that Dominican American culture and Cuban American culture and Puerto Rican American culture and Mexican American culture have nothing in common really except for Spanish. So then you could argue, some would, some wouldn't. I went back to the Ford Foundation 2 weeks ago and they had a 3-year anniversary of this symposium. And it was really interesting to be going from the hot seat to like, oh wow, you guys really got the message and tried to do something very serious. And I came back with this curator that I mentioned and the fellow. And so all of those issues, and actually today someone said, oh, why do you think when MoMA did their book on blackness, which just came out, I don't know if any of you have seen it, it's quite interesting, Darby English, who's a very smart professor, the University of Chicago edited it. They did not account for, let's say, Black Latinx culture and that intersectionality, which is a very big topic. There's one artist in that whole book, I think Wilfredo Lamb, who falls into that category. So that's a, anyway, we could talk about this for days. I think there's time for one more question. I hope that answers sort of one example. I don't know, you guys decide. I'm not going to choose between you. Or I'll try to answer really quickly, and we can both do quick questions.
This is kind of a follow-up.
Okay.
How do you balance like overlaps of identity, and how does that factor into when you're looking into intersectionality in art? So like if you have like a queer Latinx artist, or like looking at different identities and then also considering the language the artists use for themselves. So if they identify as a queer artist but they don't super incorporate like Latinx culture or something.
Well, I'm going to answer more the second part of your question because it's just interesting as a kind of museum practice question. Well, first of all, I don't go around like looking for artists through this lens. I mean, I kind of look at artists based on the work they make and kind of what is interesting to me or the other curators. But of course, some of these artists are addressing these questions in their work. Interestingly, what you said about the identifying of artists is something that the museum field is thinking about, I think, differently. So 2 times ago, we sent out a questionnaire to all the artists in the biennial, which was, how do you self-identify? What are your preferred pronouns? Would you like to be, did not include sexuality, actually, which is something we've talked about, whether you would identify as whatever on this spectrum, but did include race, a certain number of questions. We have not traditionally asked that question of artists when they come into the collection, although they do get a questionnaire about their work. And then when someone goes and, well, if the artist is dead, you assign, like, I don't know, is Nancy Prophet a black artist, an indigenous, Native American artist, both? So it would be interesting going forward that we are more respectful of artists choosing that way of thinking about themselves. Jimmy Durham is like a whole can of worms that we got into with this show here because he identifies as a Native American. He's not tribally enrolled. That creates all sorts of questions around whether you can even self-identify in that category if you believe in tribal sovereignty. But I'll stop it there. Last question.
You mentioned Instagram earlier as like a method that your curators use to find art. I just wanted you to speak about that and how that's changed the curatorial process for you.
I mean, maybe to say that they find art, I don't think that they're like trolling Instagram to look for art, but I think it's just like a way that information travels. So maybe before you'd like read art forum or go to, you know, a gallery, and now if you follow an artist and they're putting pictures of their new work there, that's like a great way to see it. Or another curator who's a friend of mine, I follow a lot of people on Instagram, I post pretty much art-related content, not like that much personal stuff, but every now and then I show my husband to his chagrin. You know, it's a great tool to understand what's happening because people, if you follow people you trust or you're interested in, whether they're artists or curators or art historians or whatever, collectors, it's neat to see what they're looking at. I mean, you can get lost in it, of course. I don't curate because of Instagram or by Instagram, but it's also interesting kind of almost like market testing, like to see what people are responding to through likes. And I wouldn't like choose like, oh, because I got the most likes, that's the painting we buy. But it's not an interesting like data point. Like I'm a chief curator of a museum in downtown New York City with 1.2 million visitors a year, 1 million visitors, make it rough, depending on whether we have a Warhol show or not. And 35% of them are millennials. So like I better be like vaguely attuned to what's happening on Instagram, even if I lose all my DMs, so don't DM me. I think on that note, I really do have to go. I saw my assistant giving me the hook, the clock.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.